All right, let's get into it. I'm going to share my screen. All right, so our next project is a little Esty shop. This is going to be a group project you'll be working on with, I think all of our groups actually worked out to be groups of 4. So yeah, this is how we're going to get started. The background is, if you think of the website Etsy, now I can't say it correctly. I think this actually originally, this Esty was a typo from Etsy.com, which you may be familiar with, especially if you're like me and this is your retail therapy, so to speak. So it's basically this idea of a platform where multiple merchants can sell items. They're not all linked to one specific merchant. You can be somebody who maybe sells vintage clothes, or you make handmade goods and you sell them from your shop. So merchants kind of all have their own little domain inside of Etsy. It's multiple merchants making multiple sales, and you can think about the app that way. So Little Esty Shop is a fictitious e-commerce platform, kind of similar to Etsy. And we're going to have merchant functionality that we're asking you to build, as well as admin functionality that we'll ask you to build that will be more related to managing inventory and fulfilling customer invoices. And we'll get more into the user stories as we work our way down. But that's the basic overview of the shop, Little Esty Shop project. Yeah, so our learning goals are here. There are 4 of them that we think are very important. The first is to practice designing a normalized database schema and define model relationships. So everything you've been working on up to this point in Mod 2 will continue to be very important, especially as it comes to understanding your database schema, making it efficient and accurate for the functionality that you're trying to build, and also having a good understanding of many-to-many relationships and one-to-many relationships. The second learning goal here is to utilize advanced routing techniques, including namespacing, to organize and group like functionality together. We'll have a class this afternoon, actually, on advanced routing techniques. So that will be very relevant to what you'll need to build in the project. The third learning goal here is utilize advanced active record techniques to perform complex database queries. So again, like with the other projects, we're going to have a lot of emphasis on active record and how to query your database in a Railsy way, in an efficient way, how to work with data from the database without relying on Ruby and using the more performant and more secure active record. We're going to give you lots of chances to practice complex active record queries on this project. And then the last one here is practice consuming a public API, utilizing porous, plain old Ruby objects as a way to apply object-oriented principles to organize code. So this week will be your introduction to working with APIs as backend developers, which I think is really exciting. We will have a few stories as part of the user stories that are specifically dedicated to API functionality and consuming an API. So yeah, you have that to look forward to. I think this is a really cool and exciting new learning goal that we haven't really touched in Mod 2 so far. So the requirements for the project, like everything else pretty much that you've been working with, we'll be using Rails 5.2 point something, Ruby 2.7.2. You'll need to use Postgres, like always in Mod 2. All of your code must be tested via feature tests and model tests. We want everybody to be using GitHub branching, team code reviews via GitHub comments, and GitHub projects to track progress on user stories. So with the last project, we set you all up with conveyor belt and had everybody move the cards as they completed functionality to the appropriate column in the project board. And a lot of the reason that we introduced this on the previous project was so that you could get very comfortable and familiar with that process, because now you'll be working on a larger team, and the project board and GitHub PR workflow and those types of things are really, really good ways to improve and just really prioritize communication on the team and keep all of your work organized and everyone informed as you're working on this together, but remotely, right? It's really good. It's a really good professional skill to spend time investing in and working on, and we think it will help you in your project as well. So we'll kind of be building on that knowledge from the last project and the GitHub project board for everybody to be on the same page and communicating using GitHub. You also must include a thorough README to describe your project and describe the purpose of the application, the functionality. It would be interesting to see maybe some challenges as you were building this out, or new learnings or new findings. I think it's a good idea to link everybody's GitHub to the README somewhere so that if an employer comes along and sees this, they know how to get to each of the contributors specifically, those types of things. And I would direct everybody to the How to Write a Great README resource, which we mentioned as one of our resources here. But just as a reminder, you can find it on the backend website under Resources Miscellaneous, How to Write a Great README. There aren't really hard and fast rules in this resource, but lots of good ideas and examples for you to go off of. Cool. And then the last requirement here is that we want everything to be deployed to Heroku. Anytime that you have a PR approved and you merge that branch into main, I would strongly recommend that is the point when you deploy this new code to Heroku. Moving forward in Turing in general, as far as I know, everything that you build will need to be deployed to Heroku, all of your projects going forward. So take your learnings from the last project and apply them here and make sure that if at all possible, you have your code deployed. Yeah. Already mentioned a little bit about the requirements up there for setup, but the idea here is, let's see, when I'll get to talking about conveyor belt in a little bit, but essentially you're going to get a forked and cloned repository through conveyor belt. One person will own that repo and then everybody will be working off of it. And we can get to like the group stuff and who fills out conveyor belt in a second. But once you get to that point, you'll be bundling, creating your database, running your test suite, and then starting by opening up your Rails S, opening up your server to see the app running. We won't really be giving you a starter repo, so to speak. There's no project here for you to build off of, but we will be providing you with some CSV files that will be relevant to the first section here in this breakdown. But I wanted to stop and see if anybody had questions up until this point before I go into the actual stuff that you'll be building. Cool, okay. So once you've got your repo cloned down, the first phase here is something we call database setup. And I mentioned we'll be providing you with some CSV files, which will load the data into the app for you. The very first step is to work through this section so that you can load in the CSV files with this data that you'll be working with. So you'll need to be writing rake tasks for these that will seed your database with the data in these files. So we've used rake tasks before, but you may know them as like Rails commands that we run. So for instance, Rails DB create or Rails DB migrate or whatever. Those are rake tasks that are alias to the command Rails. And a rake task is just something that you run once, it executes some code, it's a script, and it will go do something for you. And you can actually create your own, and that's part of the assignment here. We have included some documentation, which should be more than enough to get you started with writing some custom rake tasks. And the idea here is we want you to write the following ones, the ones that I highlighted here, to load up the data from the CSV file and populate your database. So yeah, in more recent versions of Rails, these commands are executed like this. I mentioned Rails DB create, but they are still utilizing the tool rake to execute them under the hood, even though you don't usually have to type out rake as the executable command. So from the command line, you should be able to run something like these, and then your database will be seeded with the data from the CSVs that we are providing. And you should be able to verify this by running a Rails C session and checking on your models manually. You can do something like merchant.all, right, to see if the table was populated correctly. Cool. So I mentioned this documentation that's linked here. This is a really good resource. We won't have a dedicated class to setting up these rake tasks, but I think that the documentation gives you plenty to go off of. And of course, we're here to help with any questions that you all have. So the primary key sequence, normally when creating records with Active Record, we don't want to manually set the primary key attribute, and we want to rely on Active Record in the database to assign these IDs. But the CSV file does include an ID column that we'll want you to include when creating each record to maintain the integrity of the data. So manually assigning the ID attribute will invalidate the primary key sequence, and you should include in your code, code in your rake tasks that will reset the primary key sequence for each table after the data is seeded. Yeah, so typically just to recap on what this is saying, typically we don't want anybody to be overriding the default behavior of active record in the primary key sequencing. But with this specific set of data, we do have the IDs included as a column. So we have to make sure that those two things are synced up. And if you come across questions about this and how to reset the primary key and get that all to work within your rake task, again, Code Help is a great place to discuss these problems and solutions. Yeah, I'm reading in chat. This looks nightmarishly similar to Black Thursday. It's Black Thursday 2.0. And yeah, what I would say is this is going to be a lot like Black Thursday, at least as to my knowledge of what Black Thursday is like currently. But you do have more tools at your disposal this time around, like active records. So hopefully that'll make some elements of this a lot easier. Let's see, a few schema notes here. If we have questions on these, I'm happy to elaborate, but it's pretty straightforward. You know, these items have a unit price, and that's the price the item is currently selling at. Invoice items will also have a unit price, and this is like what price the item sold at on that invoice. So it would be more of something in the past, because invoice items and items are distinct from one another. Unit price columns in the CSV files are stored as cents. So the value 1300 for a unit price is 1300 cents or $13.00. And we would recommend that you store these as integers in your database. They're more reliable and accurate than floats. And then when you're displaying these prices to the end user, you might have to do a little bit of calculation or conversion to communicate the dollar amount. Right, but it will always be an integer. So like 1331 would be $13.31, but you'd store it in your database as the integer 1331 rather than the float of like 13 point whatever, if that makes sense. In the CSV files, this one is pretty important to start thinking about early on. Both invoice and invoice item status are stored as strings in the CSV files. But in your database, we'll be asking you to store them as integers that represent different statuses. So 0 might be one status, 1 might be a different status, 2 would be a different status. And basically, we are asking the database to store these as integers because integers are much more efficient than strings. And in your models, you can map these to one another, the string from the CSV file and the integer in the database. You can map that using an enum. And some of you may have explored enums for your last project, for your previous project. But if not, this is the time to start looking into this. And there are a lot of advantages to using enums. They are both very flexible for adding, like for example, with status, you could always add another status down the line that would be accepted as a status for an item. But your database wouldn't need to do all the heavy lifting of looking at strings. It would just be storing integers, and then your Rails app will convert those database values into the more human readable statuses that we know and love. So enums will be another interesting learning goal for this project. You should not need to use any gems or dependencies to manage your enums. This is all behavior that's built into Rails. Yeah, so that's what I'll say about that. Any questions about the database setup section of the project before we move on? Marla.
For seeding to Heroku, will the rake command that we create also work with Heroku, or do we do the same like Heroku db seed? How does that work?
So typically when you're running when you're seeding using the seeds.rb file, you would run Rails db seed locally, but then on Heroku, you would also need to run something like Heroku run Rails db seed. Now, because we are moving away from that and we're asking you to write your own tasks, you will have to execute them in a similar way. So maybe locally you have Rails CSV load customers, but on Heroku, you would maybe have to double check the documentation. Don't quote me on this, but you might have to run like rake CSV load customers. Your app on Heroku will have access to all the rake tasks that you're creating the same way that it has access to the Rails DB seed. So same kind of process. This will need to be run on Heroku separately from your local environment. but you'll be running the rake task that you created rather than the built-in Rails DB, whatever behavior. Does that answer your question?
Okay, yes, yes, it does, thank you.
Sure. Yeah, essentially you are creating your own custom task that will do something similar to what Rails DBC does, but you are going to be doing a specific one that parses these specific CSV files. So you would run it the same way, but with a different command. Any other questions about this section? Okay, so going to keep moving. The next phase is user stories. So just to communicate some expectations to you all, we want you to complete database setup and user stories. Absolutely, like those are the main requirements. And then there's the section 4 for your evaluation and how to prepare for that. But then the third section is extensions. So these are not mandatory. But yeah, moving on to the user stories. This will require you to build many pages, and we won't go through the stories in very close detail, but what I will say is that, well, I think maybe we'll start with the wireframe. So if you click on one of these, it'll actually include a wireframe. And if you're not familiar with that term, a wireframe is essentially a very rough mock-up of what you want to be displayed on a page. So this isn't something that you need to follow pixel for pixel. Like you don't need to make sure you're using the same type of font and the same color here and like a certain pixel width for items ready to ship column and favorite customers column. This is more of a rough outline of what information should be on the page. You can take this and however much effort you're planning to put into styling and all that stuff, you can put your own creative spin on it. But this is to communicate that we do want the name of the app, a link to the dashboard, a link to my items, a link to my invoices, items ready to ship with this information, et cetera. These wireframes are just like a very basic guide to give you an idea of what the feature should look like from the user perspective and what they should see when they open these up. So those are there for you. Yeah, here's another example. So here we wouldn't be particularly, for this project at least, we wouldn't be upset or this wouldn't be off track for you to put like top merchants on the left side, for example, and enabled merchants and disabled merchants on the right-hand side. Really what these are here to convey is, hey, you need this information, you need this functionality, like the disable and enable buttons, for example. And this will also be described in the user stories, but this gives you like a visual guide to just kind of make sure you have all of these pieces, even if they don't look exactly like this. That's okay. And then, of course, you have the user stories. What I'll mention here is that the merchant side of the application and the admin side of the application are very similar. So I wonder what would be a good example of that. Maybe merchant items and admin merchants index. Can I maybe... This is merchant items, admin merchants index. Yeah, so here's an example of how similar these two stories would be. And you don't have to do it this way, but the project is kind of designed for you to be able to maybe split into two teams and maybe have one team tackle the merchant stories and one team tackle the admin stories. There will be similarities and there will be differences, but overall the functionality has a lot of overlap. So on the admin merchant side, you can see that you have enabled merchants and disabled merchants and the ability to toggle those back and forth. And then you have a column with some business data that's aggregated here about the top merchants. But then on the merchant side, you would have enabled items that you could disable and vice versa. And then you have a list of top items, which will take different things into consideration, but be a very similar structure to the user story, right? So that's up to you how you want to divide up the work for the bulk of the user stories. But if you want to kind of have two teams that can pair and then come back together and like talk about the project as a whole, it should work great for that kind of workflow. We do have the user stories here on this page. These are going to be word for word the same as what you'll find on the cards on the project tab once we get conveyor belt set up. So we have these here, but then on the user story page here in the README, there may be more information. Like for instance, merchant invoices gives you a little description of what this whole section is about. When a customer purchased something from a shop, a new invoice is created, etc. And then we have this section of user stories. So just there are a couple of places where we have additional information on the behavior. Like I think we also have one of those on the API stories. Yes. So for the API stories, what I would really recommend is try to divide up these 4 stories as evenly as you can. This is the first real introduction that we're giving you all to consuming APIs. And what I would hope that we can avoid is having one person on a team take all the GitHub API stories and finish that functionality, and then the other 3 people on the team don't really get the chance to practice with the GitHub API. That would not be ideal. So maybe it's not one user story per person, but each person should have some time spent on the GitHub API consumption stories, just so that we can all be sure to hit that learning goal before we ramp up into more complex API functionality. Cool. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I need to mention about these user stories. I don't think so. Does anybody have questions about what I've covered on this page? Brian.
Is admin like a login functionality?
Good question. No, we won't be implementing authentication or authorization. It'll be similar to the last project where you'll set up a specific route or namespace a certain controller to route all the admin behavior to.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Good question. What else? Any other questions here? Awesome. Marla.
Yeah, I was just curious with the testing, is this another situation, at least when we did Black Thursday in Mod 1, where we were encouraged to kind of create mock tests, like mock test files to grab from? It seems like maybe this is another scenario where that might be useful for us.
Can you tell me more about these mock tests? Sorry, I'm not as familiar with how the rubric is for that project these days.
Yeah, no worries. Basically, we just created like mock CSV files, fixture files. Thank you, Brian, for correcting me there. We created fixture files that had basically, like, instead of like the 1,000 entries in the CSV file, we had maybe like 50 or something, just to make testing run a little bit smoother. So yeah, I was just curious if that's going to be encouraged in this project as well, or if there's a different way we should approach it.
Gotcha. I don't anticipate that you're going to need any fixtures for testing. What I do think would be something really good to look into for when you're writing tests for this behavior would be something like FactoryBot, because some of these tests will require very complex interactions and workflows as you're making these, calculations that are happening in active record, and testing those, and testing when tables have to join and stuff like that. I think rather than reaching for fixtures, I would recommend that you reach for factories if it becomes an issue. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
No problem. Good question. All right. Cool. Please stop me if any other questions come up, but for now I'm gonna just spend a little bit of time on the extensions. Here we have tiers for the extensions. So the first one would be considered the least difficult. You would build a little bit of extra admin functionality to user stories here, and then do something for styling, just something consistent throughout the website. And many people have already been experimenting with Bootstrap. I think that's a great way to go. You are also free to create custom styles if you'd rather do that. Might get a little bit more practice with CSS that way. The second tier is a more difficult extension, and this would be implementing the filters user story. And that's all that is part of that extension. And then for the most difficult extensions, you can kind of pick your own adventure. You can come up with your own feature if you think there's something that we really should be doing on this project or that you really want to build. You can research Action Cable and implement chat functionality. Action Cable is a lot of fun. It's a WebSocket, if any of you are familiar with that kind of behavior, where essentially your chat would be listening constantly for updates. So this would be a challenging extension, but I've worked with Action Cable, and I think it's kind of fun if you end up having extra time. There's the cart functionality. We have a lesson plan you could go off of for that one, where you could actually allow visitors to add items to a cart. And I think that this would be really relevant information for moving into mod 3, where you'll be looking more closely at things like sessions and cookies. And yeah, actually, I think I covered all of them. So if you really want to push yourself on an extension and you have the base functionality already done, this would be the most difficult. You also have these other 2 tiers to pick from. And, if all you get to is styling for an extension, that, we don't have any expectations for styling beyond the very basic information that we presented in the wireframes. So yeah, those are all options if you want to push yourself even more. Let's see. Yep, I'm just catching up with chat. Yeah, Active Record is beast mode compared to what you had in your disposal last mod. I would expect it to make things a lot faster, which is great. Cool, so I think I'll move on to the evaluation section. Yeah, so let's see, before we get to the eval, yeah. So here's the rubric. I thought I would just introduce this because we do have another category here. We have our typical feature completeness, Rails, Active Record, testing and debugging categories. But then we're also going to be keeping an eye on the API consumption just to see how those stories went for you all. And if you really, this is a question that comes up a lot as people get started in the API stories. You could go above and beyond and use webmock to test your API calls, but this is not required. This would be almost extension category of work. To get a passing score in the API consumption category, we just want them to be completed and fully functional. You do not need to test them. You could also do something kind of in between these two where you have functioning API consumption stories and then you write some tests that include like maybe something happening with an API, but you manually mock and or stub API responses in order to get those tests to pass without actually hitting the API every time you run your tests. So that's just something to keep an eye out for. But I wanted to make it very clear that we do not expect you to test your API calls or use webmock. That's not something that we're necessarily looking for, though it's encouraged if you are interested and have the bandwidth. So that's the only change to the rubric that I can think of. Yeah, so as far as your evaluation, it will be 2 15 to 20 minute presentations from you all, and then we will dedicate 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A where we will ask you questions maybe about your process, maybe about a particular Active Record query, maybe what was most challenging, or what's the code you don't want to show me. We might ask you a few questions after you do your presentation just to get more information about how the project went for you and give you better feedback. So I would say for these presentations, try to break into pairs and present a single user story for each pair. Demonstrate it from start to finish on Heroku. It would be a good idea to choose something that was difficult or tricky to implement, because that allows us to give you hopefully more pertinent feedback that will be more helpful to you in the long run. You should read through the user story description on the card in the GitHub project board to get started, demo it on Heroku. And if there are happy and sad paths, be sure to demonstrate both of them. Then we'll ask you to walk through the tests for the user story, so the feature tests, and then moving on from the feature tests, any associated model tests for that kind of behavior. And then we'll ask you to walk through the implementation code for the user story, including how that factors into your DB schema, what your models look like, what model logic you're using, what data logic is happening, how that information is getting mapped through the controllers, routes and views. And you don't have to use slides if you would like to present any particular information in the form of slides. That's totally fine to supplement code sharing, because we are asking for about 20 minutes of demo time. Yeah, so you can use slides, but you don't have to. And this lives on the GitHub repo. So as we get closer to evaluation, you'll have that there for your reference. As far as when this is due, let me look at the calendar here. So we're kicking this off today. It's Monday, and it will be due on Wednesday evening. And there will be, I haven't added it yet, but there will be a calendar event here where you will be able to submit your project, and there will be like a project survey. You might have to scroll down a little bit just to give you a little bit of insight in how we've been adding calendar events for project deadlines. our reasoning is if we make the project due at 9 a.m. on Thursday, it'll be a late night for a lot of people. I think you all put a lot of really good effort into your work and want to put your best foot forward, and that's great. But we do want you to get a good night's sleep. So we take submissions typically late in the evening, like 9 or 10 o'clock the day before the project eval. So keep an eye on the calendar. There will be an event for you to submit your work through. And this is like more or less a 10-day project. So you get the rest of this week and most of next week to work on this with your group. Shortly, I'll be sending out your groups and a link for conveyor belt. And your very first task will be to pick somebody from the group to fill out conveyor belt and own the repo. Yeah, so that'll be the next step here. Does anybody have questions? Matt.
I'm curious as to whether or not there's a single place, or if not a single place, just a list of resources to use so that we can research all the concepts that'll be necessary for this project.
Yeah, I think that everything you will need for the base functionality beyond except for extensions should be linked in the repo. So I know that there's one resource linked here in the database setup section. And then I would imagine that everything you need for GitHub will be linked down here. We will describe the behavior you'll need to get from GitHub, but part of this will just be researching the official docs of the GitHub API. We haven't linked it directly because we think that there will be a few areas of the documentation that you'll need to explore. But beyond that, I think the main external resource that you would need for the core functionality would be linked here in the database setup portion. The rest should have to do with either API stuff or the learning goals we've already been going over. So does that answer your question? Was there a particular area where you think we could maybe stand to link a little bit more helpful documentation?
I think what you've provided so far is a good starting point. So that answers my question just fine.
Awesome, I'm glad. Yeah, and I will say that for the extensions, it totally depends upon which extension you want to do. You could definitely use resources that we don't mention here, but we tried to include like lesson plans and stuff to at least get you started with the recommended extensions. Brian.
How difficult is WebMock compared to like regular mocks and stubs?
That's a difficult question for me to answer well, unfortunately. I'd say it's difficult in that it's an added layer onto the RSpec tools that you already have. And sometimes the syntax to get things working correctly and mocking and stubbing the external API calls correctly can be difficult, especially if you're not super familiar with how APIs work already in Rails. So I would say if you want to dedicate time to using WebMock to test your API calls, maybe do it iteratively. I definitely recommend getting the API calls working first, consuming the API, mostly because it's a brand new tool and we wouldn't want your learning to be impeded by the fact that we're asking you to TDD. So I would say get the consumption stories functioning and working, get the rest of your tests to a good place, and then maybe time box, maybe I wouldn't spend more than 5 hours working on WebMock over the course of these next 2 weeks. I think that would be more than enough. And if you're spending more than 5 hours on WebMock, you probably learned enough to put it aside until month 3, in my opinion, or at least until the next project where you could experiment with it again.
Thanks.
Sure. Any other questions? And then Kelly, are you here?
Yep, I'm here.
Hi, sorry, I realize I've gone over time a little bit, but are you okay with starting your class at 40?
Yep, sounds good.
All right, I will be sending out those project groups shortly. And please just designate somebody to fill out the conveyor belt information. If you have any other questions, you can ping us in Code Help or in the cohort channel. But I will let you all go so you can have a POM before the next class. And keep an eye on the cohort channel for your groups. So I'll send them out like literally in a minute. Thanks, everybody.